Kate, what do you mean by religious absolutism?
Well, by absolutism, I refer to absolute authority. If you have absolute truth, then you have absolute authority, and then you can dictate. And so religious absolutism is not compatible with democracy. Just for starts, it's not compatible with democracy. But religious absolutism takes two forms. And one is papal infallibility, and the other is biblical inerrancy. And these are not ancient teachings. These are not traditional doctrines. Papal infallibility and biblical inerrancy, by inerrancy meaning the Bible is without error, it's literally true. Those teachings show up in the 1870s and 1880s for the very first time, and they shocked many people. They were widely opposed. It was a very small subset of Christians making these dramatic claims. Biblical inerrancy and papal infallibility are religious forms of totalitarianism. And the period where they show up is in general, in European culture, a period where there's a dramatic backlash against democracy and universal human rights, and an effort to reclaim the kind of single, unified, centralized authority that we had, for instance, in the Middle Ages with divine right monarchs and all of that. But now on a philosophically modernist and much more rigorous basis. Because yes, religion has always had authority, but not that sort of sweeping and absolute authority, which is politically really very dangerous.
So in a sense, it seems like what you're describing is an attempt to use the conditions and the logic and the discourse of the modern world of modernity to combat sort of the pluralizing and democratic effects of modernity.
Yes, and in that way it's really quite paradoxical that this is a modernist attempt to oppose modernism. If by modernism you mean democracy and universal human rights and so forth. But modernism is a very complicated sort of movement, and part of it was the idea that reason can take the place of king, and reason can dictate absolutely everything. And so that all rational people will always agree on everything everywhere, which is irrational. But that was the effort. And so that all of the modern fundamentalisms in any tradition are, philosophically speaking, modernist. But what matters to me is not necessarily what philosophical label you put on it, but recognizing first how dangerous it is to claim that I have a truth that no one else can question. Because I have unquestionable truth, I deserve unquestionable authority. To recognize just how dangerous that is. And second, to recognize that there are alternatives to that within Christianity itself. This is not an ancient Christian teaching. This is a recent and dangerous distortion of ancient Christian teachings.
It seems sort of straightforwardly the case that religions themselves are inherently authoritarian. They make these kind of claims to making truth statements about everything.
That religion itself is naturally authoritarian.
Right.
It's a matter of how you define religion. And religion has been defined in these ways because of the popular perception that biblical inerrancy and papal infallibility and this sort of authoritarian absolutist stuff is necessarily and instinctively Christian when it's not. What is religion is the question here. Religion, I think, is a system of symbols intended to help us to articulate and stabilize important elements of human experience, inward sorts of experiences of meaning and identity and value, sorts of experiences that we can't easily articulate directly or without metaphor. And if religion is an effort to talk about certain inward experiences that we have, for instance, for me as a Christian, a sense that compassion is real and compassion is powerful, and compassion permeates and sustains everything, that's a very different way of understanding what religion is than seeing religion as simply an authority structure.
In a sense, isn't the reduction of the Bible to just story and narrative kind of what atheists do?
Sure. It's a common atheist complaint that the Bible is really just a bunch of stories. And to say that something is just a story is like saying, oh, that's just an electron. That's just this teensy speck of energy. How can you take electrons so seriously? Stories, like electrons, are some of the most powerful things around. They almost are pure power. And as electrons can lead us to nuclear weapons, quantum mechanics can lead us that way. Stories can lead us to war and destruction too. Stories, cognitively speaking, stories are the way the mind organizes and remembers the most complex information. Stories are the most robust media we have for maintaining or remembering and transmitting complex information and insight about reality, which is itself very, very complicated. Even a scientific paper tells a story. I asked, I tested, I found. And so the stories of Scripture, the archetypal stories of Scripture, offer us the core set of symbols through which we interpret vast swaths of tremendous wisdom about what it means to be human and how we ought to relate to one another and what the consequences are of our relating to one another in one way or another way. And so it matters to me immensely whether these stories are being distorted and misread in literal-minded ways that are profoundly antisocial. You don't have to be Christian to object to the misreading of Christian scripture, just as you don't have to be Buddhist to object to the Taliban blowing up statues of the Buddha. These are immensely powerful symbols and stories at the core of Western experience, and symbols and stories are at the core of our most sophisticated wisdom and insight about who we are and where we're going together.
So you talk about the development of biblical literalism in the 1870s, that time frame. What's wrong with biblical literalism?
No one in the ancient world would have read the Bible literally. In the ancient world, which is to say in the rhetorical and literary traditions in which the Bible was written, the Hebrew Bible, and in which the Christian scriptures were composed, in those literary traditions, the literal level of the text was its least significant aspect. That was not where the meaning of the text was to be found. The significance of the text existed at the metaphorical, the allegorical, and the symbolic levels. The literal level of the text was more like the glass facade of a skyscraper. The glass wall of a skyscraper doesn't carry any weight. It keeps the rain out. It keeps the people from falling out. But that's all. It doesn't carry any of the weight of the building. Similarly, the literal level of the text was a device for helping people to remember the text. It's like, why are the earliest texts written in poetry? Because poetic devices make it easier to remember things. Why can we all remember the ditty 30 days hath September, April, June, and November? Because the rhymes help us. Story, narrative functioned in the same way. In the ancient world, a whole array of very major theologians cautioned that to read Scripture literally is to expose Scripture to contempt. And they singled out the creation stories in Genesis as a clear example of a text that should never, ever be read literally. And so when people started arguing in the 1870s that the whole Bible should be read literally and only literally, they're flying in the face of thousands of years of understanding of how Scripture functions, how texts functioned in the ancient world. Now, texts don't function that way in an empirical culture. We want the facts. Give me the straight story. Tell me what happened, and I'll decide the meaning for myself. That's not the way ancient texts were written. And so to read Scripture literally in this way is to destroy what its authors and their first audiences felt was the most important aspect of what the text had to say. It's a terrible, terrible, and really very dangerous mistake.
On the same coin, you talk about the sort of simultaneous development of papal infallibility. Could you talk about what you see as problematic there?
No one had ever thought that popes couldn't make mistakes. No one ever imagined that being elevated to the office of the papacy rescued any man from the human condition. In medieval art, popes are often featured among the damned in hell. And so to allow this one particularly reactionary pope in legally very, very dubious ways to assert that by virtue of his office, he could not make a mistake was ridiculous. Lord Acton said at the time, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it has, in practice, created tremendous problems for the Catholic Church as an institution because it means that no mistake can ever be fixed. Every mistake is irretrievable because to correct a mistake made by a predecessor or to change or disagree with the teaching because other facts or truths have come to light is catastrophic. It's just catastrophic. And, and it was never, that's never the way the papacy was understood. Did the Pope have authority? Sure. Did he have leadership? Absolutely. Was he somehow exempted from the human condition? No.
You use a phrase, a concept in this book, moral imagination. Could you talk about what you mean by that? Imagination in general is a term that we begin to see in European thought beginning in the 1640 or so. And it was the philosophical term for the fact that the mind is active in perception. The perception is not a passive process as if we're television stations, television sets that are just wired to receive cable signals in a very transparent way. The mind is active in perception, which it creates all kinds of questions and problems about what does it mean to be true if my mind is processing data and your mind is processing data. But, fast forward a couple of hundred years of philosophers working on this problem. The imagination is the mind's ability to recognize and create patterns. That's what Einstein was talking about when he said imagination is more important than knowledge. His point there was that patterns in the data matter more than anything else. Without patterns, data is just bricks stacked up on a pallet in a brickyard. It doesn't get us anywhere. We can't build anything with it until we begin to see patterns. And imagination is our ability to recognize patterns, the paradigms, models, frameworks, call them what you will. Philosophers of science and philosophers in other fields have come up with all sorts of words for the fact that reality is
We organize reality according to models. And imagination is our ability to do that. And moral imagination, then, is the ability to come to recognize and to create the patterns that most deeply reveal what it means to be human and how it is we ought to live. How do you know what it means to be who you are, what it means to be human, or how you ought to live in the midst of difficulties and complexities in your own life? You're looking for patterns. What sorts of actions have had what sort of consequences? What's the pattern here? And metaphors are how we convey that. Metaphors convey relationships, which is to say patterns.